There are some middle-class coded things which are just great. At least I think so. One is cream tea. Another is country pubs. There's Waitrose, free tea and coffee and M&S sandwiches. The chicken coronation really is sublime. I recommend it. But best of all are literary festivals. Generally taking place in the summer among idyllic surroundings, they see thousands of people converge to eat, drink and discuss books. It's so far so harmless and utterly delightful. Well, not according to Fossil-Free Books. Just a few weeks ago, they organised a boycott of the Hay Festival, one of the world's leading literary get-togethers that happens every year at Hay on Wye. Now, one of the main sponsors of the festival is, or rather was, Baillie Gifford. They're an investment management firm managing more than, wait for it, £225 billion in assets. And according to Fossil-Free Books, they're accused of profiting from fossil fuels as well as, quote, Israeli apartheid occupation and genocide. Faced with that boycott from several authors, Hay suspended its sponsorship deal with Baillie Gifford. Then, Edinburgh International Book Festival, which had previously defended its sponsorship deal, did the same. At that point, the firm announced it would stop funding UK literary festivals altogether. That's a commitment presently worth around £1 million a year. Now, for Fossil-Free Books, this came as something of a surprise, not least because Baillie Gifford has fewer investments in hydrocarbons than similarly sized investment funds. Only 2% of the assets it manages are invested in fossil fuel companies, compared to an industry average of around 11%. Surely then, that would make their divestment away from fossil fuels easier. Apparently not, with the fund telling the Guardian newspaper this. We are managers of other people's money, not our own. We are not in a position to make exclusions of that nature based on our own ethical judgments or in response to pressure from outside groups. For their part, Fossil-Free Books have been surprised by the immediacy of their success. I wouldn't call it a victory, Omar Hamilton, one boycotter, told The Guardian. Another, author Guy Gunaratne, noted that several of the statements put out by festivals when their ties with Baillie Gifford were broken mentioned their positive relationship with the firm. He says, "It was that relationship that we were trying to get them to leverage in order to talk to them about divesting." This was meant to be the start of a conversation, a jumping off point it seems, but Baillie Gifford went straight into top gear. But whatever your views on the boycott and the subsequent response, one weapon that Fossil-Free Books have in their armoury is sneering liberals. Here's The Guardian's Marina Hyde speaking about Fossil-Free Books on the podcast The Rest is Entertainment.
One of the things that I particularly don't admire is the suggestion that everything is politics and that art is the same as politics. And that all art, by the way, some art is political and much art is born of its time and therefore can have that sort of relationship to politics. But it is art and politics are not the same. And if you insist that all art must be politicised and all artists must make statements all the time, then what you are essentially wishing for is a contraction of the human experience, a contraction of human possibility, because you're saying these things essentially semantically map onto each other. This is nonsense, okay? Art can exist just for its own sake. The pleasure of these things just for their own sake must be allowed to exist. When I think of these people, I think of them and I think they're the sort of people who had been saying to Shakespeare, do you, William Shakespeare, condemn Elizabeth I's brutal suppression of the uprisings in Ireland? Do you? Why haven't you said anything? Why haven't you signed a letter saying anything? If you don't sign it, William Shakespeare, then this new play of yours, The Taming of the Shrew, we're going to protest this. You know, is it any good? And I just feel that not everything has to involve someone saying, they say, oh, you've got the luxury of that because you don't live in Gaza or whatever. This is, I'm afraid, throughout the whole of human history, awful things have been happening. But art must be allowed to exist in and of itself, and it doesn't have to answer any questions, and people should be allowed to come and listen to by the way, anyone you talk to at these book festivals say, if you want to hear people talking about these issues,
100%.
The best place to hear them is at these festivals. The thing that Baillie Gifford's funding at something like the Cheltenham Festival was being primarily directed towards now is the outreach programmes for children. They will now go.
Yeah.
Okay. So these people have not thought anything through. And also they are that sort of modern thing that everything is politics and everything must be politicized is limiting, and it is a contraction of the mind. And it cannot be, things must be allowed to exist in and of themselves and not have to be politicized.
That was Marina Hyde there, daughter of Sir Alistair Edgecombe James Dudley Williams, 2nd Baronet, saying that not everything is political. And I mean, sure, not everything is political. My choice of socks this morning, that was not political. What I had for dinner last night, not really that political. Will I be walking the dog at some point this week when it's raining? Absolutely not political. But patronage of the arts and what constitutes legitimate sources of funding for them, well, that is absolutely, undeniably political. Yes, it always has been. The fact that the papacy funded much of the Renaissance is political. Picasso, Bauhaus, and Dickens are all very political people and movements. They're driven by very political ideals. These were people who cared about politics. And now that's not to say you cannot enjoy art and books if you don't have a PhD in their political and historical context. That's stupid. But this conversation is definitely a thing. It's not new. And on the issue of the boycott, I can genuinely see both sides of the argument. Though I can't see why Baillie Gifford couldn't at least offer a 10-year plan to fully divest from fossil fuels. It's 2% of their portfolio. And yes, we need to move beyond this stuff. But at the same time, it's fair to ask whether funding from, say, the British government, which is partially funded through tax receipts on oil and gas production, is any better. But back to Marina Hyde. Some art is political. Well, not all of it. How can art not be political? How can it not express certain ideas, values, and assumptions? And then, of course, there is the link between artistic patronage and war. This is from the Financial Times about one Zach Gertler. Individuals tend to receive less scrutiny because they're often one step removed from their investments. And nonetheless, students at London's Goldsmiths College are occupying the Centre for Contemporary Art, calling for the university to cut its ties with donors Candida and Zach Gertler. In 2019, Zach was reported to have hosted a birthday party for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Little party. If you're hosting a birthday party for Benjamin Netanyahu, who I personally think is a war criminal, then yes, people are absolutely within their rights to boycott you, to say, we don't want your money funding this institution. Elsewhere in that same article, one interviewee talks about how abolishing non-dom status will impact the arts because apparently non-doms are great benefactors. I'm sure they are. They aren't paying any tax. And yes, making that point is political. Sorry, Marina. Helena, this is a really complex topic. And like I say, I understand arguments from both sides, but trust media liberals to make protesting against a literary festival sound like the end of days. What do you make of it all?
The optics are complex. The optics are certainly complex about what happens when issues of this magnitude get magnified, even more so by the fact that it impacts people's enjoyment of art. That's something that is optically difficult. I mean, part of protest, part of boycotts, part of being able to try and speak about the political ramifications of investments and the way in which that we engage in our consumption, that's always going to be able to make you enemies somewhere. And indeed, plenty of protests in this way have been well known to cause lots of issues. Look at how Just Stop Oil have been received by the public, and very negatively, of course. I can understand why people are frustrated, saying, well, now hang on a minute, why is all of these things happening to, that might impact these funding avenues for these kind of cultural things that I want to be able to enjoy. The optics are certainly complex, but the principle is super, super simple, right? You have investments in fossil fuels. We want people to divest from fossil fuels. The only way that we can do this, because clearly there is no market-driven reason for them to do so within their own set of material interests, right? If you are an investment firm, if you're someone who is using that investment firm and say like a blind trust, for example, like there is no reason within a market framework for them not to engage in the investment in fossil fuels because it is profitable. Like that's the one mechanic around capitalism that underpins all of it. You need to make profit. You need to make money. And things like the negative externalities of what happens when you invest in the fossil fuel industry is not taken account of within that singular framework. So there has to be a broader consensus in how we consume, in how we engage with those markets to try and force people who otherwise make profit-driven decisions to have their profits impacted otherwise, or have their position compromised in how people would engage with them within the market, which might impact their profits, to be able to make certain different business decisions that would otherwise be profitable for them. Look at, for example, the comparison with South African apartheid, right? You invest in South African apartheid, we boycott you to try and get you to stop. This is a super, super simple procedure. And it's very interesting that when it comes to things like climate change or, BDS with regards to Israel, a lot of the kind of liberal media journalists find it very, very uncouth when they would similarly have absolutely been supportive of any kind of boycott that went against apartheid South Africa. You know what the saying is? How most liberals will only care about the social battles of the past, the ones that have already been won, but anything that's happening at the moment they don't want to know about. And that's, I think, is indicative of a very kind of anti-youth bias amongst a load of the liberal journalist class in this country, where they look at a social issue that young people really care about, and they feel like they should take an opposite position because it seems to be a bit gauche for them to want to get involved in. And hence why you get these kind of ridiculous reactions like you saw from Mainhide, as you say, treating something like removal of funding because of a boycotting principle as being like it's the end of days. And really and truly, it's upholding an incredibly simple principle that we need to exercise and we need to leverage to ensure that people divest from things that are net negative utility for society.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's a point about our culture now. It's clearly changed in the last 20 years because of social media, all kinds of things. I mean, it's not going away, by the way. It's here. And people are scrutinized in a way they simply weren't. Any kind of concentration of power or authority can be scrutinized in a way that it just simply was unthinkable 20 years ago. And that can be good, that can be bad. It's just the reality of where we are, right? That's inarguable. That's one point. We can have that discussion, very interesting. The second point is we need to move away from fossil fuels. And like you just said there, Helena, the return on fossil fuel projects is around 15, 20%. The return on renewable projects is around 5%. And if you're trying to maximize shareholder returns, which these organizations do, by the way, that's why the state ultimately has to be involved. Boycotts only go so far. We need to move their investment towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. And that isn't going to happen through the profit motive. So what these people are trying to do is exercise cultural power, right? Cultural capital. They're trying to use the influence they have as people in that industry, as writers, as book workers, et cetera, publicists. And you can talk about whether or not, did they go too quickly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fine. Interesting conversation. But should there be a very clear political confrontation with regards to people that invest in fossil fuels? I think that's really hugely important, by the way, in what might be viewed as politically progressive social circles, like at literary festivals. Absolutely, that should be highlighted. Absolutely. And yes, that is political. And we cannot run away from it. You can't say that climate change is this huge issue and then say, oh, well, my literary festival is more important. I like literary festivals. I just said it. For me, it's up there with M&S Gold Tea and Waitrose sandwiches. Love it. But climate change is kind of a big deal, Marina.